Hello and welcome to the final Novara Live of the year. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, we made it. How are you feeling? Are you ready for your Christmas break?
Just about, Michael. I don't have my tinsel. I don't have my Santa hat, but I'm very much in the festive mood.
I feel like in the early Novara days, we might have sort of found some tinsel or a Novara hat. What's happened to us? We're so serious now. Coming up on tonight's show, we do have a number of serious stories for you tonight, actually. How the Democrats protected Biden for years throughout his cognitive decline, which could actually be one of the sort of big things I think 2024 is remembered for, especially when it comes to what that led to. Donald Trump. I have a really important interview with Laila Soueif. She's on day 82 of a hunger strike protesting the imprisonment and political persecution of her son in Egypt. Really privileged that she came into the studio on day 82 of her hunger strikes. We've got that interview for you. First, though, we want to take a moment to thank every one of you who's tuned in, whether you've just discovered us recently or have been with us since the beginning. Your support means the world to us, and we couldn't have come this far without you. We're incredibly proud of what we've been able to achieve together this year. We've grown our team, and we continue to bring you a show every weeknight, but we're aiming high, and there's still so much more we want to do. So right now, nearly 900,000 of you are subscribed to our YouTube channel. Now, if an extra 1% of you donated the equivalent of 1 hour's wage each, or even £1 per month, that would mean more presenters, better studios, bigger stories, bigger guests, and a show that continues to push boundaries. We're ready to take on next year, but we need more of you to join us to do that. So don't wait, join our community of supporters today. You can do that by heading over to novaramedia.com/support, or you can follow the link in the description to get involved and make a difference today. Thank you again for your incredible support, and we hope you enjoy the final show of the year. The BBC has the most visited news website in the world, giving the corporation extraordinary power in shaping public opinion on world events. It also has within its mandate to report on the news with fairness and impartiality. However, a new investigation by a friend of the show, Owen Jones, suggests that many within the BBC do not believe its coverage of Israel's war on Gaza has met those objectives. The piece is published on Dropsite News and is called The BBC's Civil War Over Gaza. One element of that civil war comes in the form of an open letter to BBC management. This is from Owen's article. So he writes, in November, journalists' outrage at the corporation's overall coverage spilled out into the open after more than 100 BBC employees signed a letter accusing the organisation, along with other broadcasters, of failing to adhere to its own editorial standards. The BBC lacked, quote, consistently fair and accurate evidence-based journalism in its coverage of Gaza, unquote, across its platforms, they wrote. The employees also requested that BBC make a series of specific changes, and this is a direct quote from that open letter, reiterating that Israel does not give external journalists access to Gaza, making it clear when there is insufficient evidence to back up Israeli claims, highlighting the extent to which Israeli sources are reliable or unreliable, making clear where Israel is the perpetrator in article headlines, providing proportionate representation of experts in war crimes and crimes against humanity, including regular historical context predating October 2023, use of consistent language when discussing both Israeli and Palestinian deaths, and robustly challenging Israeli government and military representatives in all interviews. So those are the demands, or some of the demands, from those employees at the BBC in that open letter. And Owen writes, one BBC journalist told me that the letter was a last resort after several tried to engage using the usual channels with management and we were just ignored. Another journalist tells me they hadn't signed the letter because they weren't aware of it, saying the strength of feeling went way beyond the signatory. Now, as you saw there, that letter mentioned the failure of the BBC to be clear when Israel is the perpetrator of acts of violence or deaths in headlines. Now, one of the more shocking examples on that front concerned a young man named Mohammed Bahar. He was a 24-year-old Palestinian man with Down syndrome and autism. His home was raided by the Israeli military in July. Bahar was then attacked by the military unit's dog and locked in a room while his family were forced to leave at gunpoint. You might remember this story, really, really horrific. A week later, the family returned home to find Bahar's decomposing body. Really, really horrific story showing the brutality of the Israeli military. However, this was how the BBC framed that outrageous story, the lonely death of Gaza man with Down syndrome. After public outrage again, which you might remember, that headline was ultimately changed to this: Gaza man with Down syndrome attacked by IDF dog and left to die, mother tells BBC. So a lot more accurate there. Referring to this particular story, Owen Jones in his piece writes this: the Bar story symbolises what the BBC staffers who spoke to Dropsite News say they want. Stronger assurances that BBC's Israel and Gaza coverage upholds the organisation's policies around impartiality. As one BBC journalist told me, there has to be a moral line drawn in the sand, and if this story isn't it, then what? Owen's report also draws on statistical analyses that show how Israeli and Palestinian deaths are covered differently. The piece presented research by data journalists Dana Najjar and Jan Letava, showing the BBC is less likely to use humanising language to refer to Palestinians than when it refers to Israelis. And the analysis also shows that the organisation refers to Palestinian deaths only slightly more often than Israeli deaths, despite the fact the Palestinian death toll is now the higher of the two by a factor of at least 28. So that could suggest something is going wrong there. I'm joined now by Owen Jones. Thank you for joining us. Thank you back on the show. It's a really interesting piece. Extensive, 9,000 words, contains a lot more detail than I could include in that introduction. I should say, before we begin talking, the piece also includes lots of fascinating stories about individuals at the BBC, which we're going to generally steer clear of in this discussion because they aren't here to defend themselves. Owen, let's hear from you. Why did you think this was an important investigation to pursue?
It's interesting, actually, you mentioned Mohammed Bahar, because that's actually where this story began. A BBC journalist got in touch with me about it, and that's because I was one of the people on social media. There were many, of course, who were outraged by the original headline, and that was an example where internal external pressure actually made an impact. They were forced to shift, but they got in touch and said this was, this had been going on for so long. They had been organising internally, and the point they'd made is that they hadn't got anywhere. And what the BBC had tried to do is pathologise their problems. They tried to treat it as though basically they were, emotionally suffering, basically try to palm them off to a helpline, or that it was basically, quote unquote, a Muslim issue. So it's my cat attacking the camera. That the BBC, that this was Muslim journalists who had a particular grievance with the problem. Now, with the BBC's coverage. Now, the reason I thought it was so important is because, brutally speaking, without the complicity of the Western media, this genocide would not have been able to happen. What the journalists point to all the way through is not specific to the BBC. It is the constant foregrounding of Israeli claims and treating them as though they're credible or even factual in a way you wouldn't, of course, with the Russian state, for example, on issues to do with atrocities. So, really, one example, there's many examples, but before 7th of October, there was a 16-year-old Palestinian girl who was killed by the Israeli military in the West Bank. And the headline was, Israel says likely killed Palestinian girl in error. I mean, that was the story about her being killed. The first paragraph, Israel says its forces appear to have unintentionally killed a 16-year-old Palestinian girl amid a gun battle with militants in the occupied West Bank. I mean, imagine a 16-year-old Israeli girl who had been killed by Palestinian gunmen. Would it be framed as, Palestinian militants say they likely killed Israeli girl in error? I mean, of course not. Let's be real here. So there's the foregrounding of Israeli claims all the time. There's the minimizing of atrocities committed against Palestinians, either by not being reported at all, or by the way they're whitewashed. Israeli statements of intent erased, often not reported. So, for example, Israeli officials and leaders talking in genocidal terms about the Palestinian people. So there's the dehumanization of Palestinians. Now, the point you made there about how Palestinian deaths don't have the due weight, your viewers may have noticed a massive spike in the mentions of Palestinian deaths, because normally what's happened, as you saw in that graph, they competed for coverage, Palestinian and Israeli deaths, violent deaths, I should say. There was one exception at the beginning of April, massive spike in the mention of Palestinian deaths on the BBC's online coverage. The reason for that is chilling. It was because Israel attacked the World Central Kitchen aid convoy and killed several Westerners. And because of that, the BBC then repeatedly covered it because Westerners had been killed. Their Palestinian driver was killed alongside them. So they kept going through all the nationalities of the people killed, ending with, and their Palestinian driver. And that drove up the number of Palestinian deaths being mentioned. And it was only because Western blood had been spilled. The point about all of this is this has warped people's understanding of what's happened. It's astonishing, actually, that so many people have come to the conclusions they have about what Israel has done to the Palestinian people, because the BBC, in its online coverage, the most powerful news website on earth, has systematically failed. That has enabled this to continue. And those journalists got in touch with me, frankly, because they're at the end of their tether. Many of them are leaving, thinking of leaving. Others are saying they need to fight to change, but they felt that this needed to be exposed because it was having such a huge impact on allowing this to happen in the first place.
I mean, I've read the article. I think it's really persuasive, has sort of lots of important content in there. I suppose a question for you I had is sometimes one I have about our own coverage as well, and my own coverage, was because we often sort of spot examples of clear BBC bias. There was an Emma Barnett interview sort of a while ago. She was interviewing different ambassadors, and we sort of pointed out how unbalanced it was. And then, we'll often give it a title, sort of BBC bias on show. But then sometimes sort of in the same week, we might, for example, show a really brilliant sort of report by Jeremy Bowen on the ground, sort of talking about Israeli atrocities in what I think is a fairly balanced way. And I suppose, where do you stand on that? Is there, do you think we should be clear to sort of say the BBC has sort of multitudes within it? Some of it's really good, some of it's terrible, some of it should be better. I mean, how do you approach this question?
Well, I think first of all, there has been across Western media outlets, you can find excellent examples of journalism. I mean, for example, I'll give you an example. CNN did a detailed rebuttal of Israeli claims about the flour massacre. People might remember this is when Palestinians were massacred whilst trying to get food. The Israeli state just made up a pack of lies, as they routinely do. About a month later, CNN took that apart. New York Times has done pieces, for example, about the use of Palestinians as human shields by the Israeli state, about £2,000 bombs being dropped on so-called safe areas. The Washington Post deconstructed the November 2023 assault on Al-Shifa Hospital and Israeli claims. The point I'm making is, this is why you have to look at it as a whole, as a systemic problem, because you get these individual examples of really good coverage which are detached from the overall narrative. It's a really interesting case. For example, if you look at, I'll give you an example, the famine in Gaza. That's a famine created by the Israeli state. They said from the beginning they were going to besiege Gaza. They said human animals are dealt with accordingly. We're cutting off all, the essentials of life. They said what they were going to do, and then they did it. Aid agencies, UN agencies all said they're cutting off all the aid. That's why there's a famine developing. Two US agencies, the USAID and the State Department's refugee agency in April said Israel is deliberately cutting off aid. The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, ordered Israel in January to avoid committing genocide against the Palestinian people to ensure the supply of humanitarian aid. The point is, that's not woven in. If you read the BBC's coverage of Gaza, of the famine in Gaza, that's not woven in at all. Any of that. You might get outlier examples. Do you see what I mean? But the overall coverage strips away that context, and you are none the wiser when you read the overwhelming majority of BBC articles about why there's a famine in Gaza at all. And that's a general problem with Western media coverage. The scale of this crime is too big to just completely ignore all the horrors that are actually being committed by the Israeli state. The problem is the overall narrative is one which is whitewashing the reality of what's happening. And there are always good exceptions. And it is notable, you're absolutely right, the reporters on the ground, Jeremy Bowen being one, are, because they've seen the reality too much, are the most balanced in that regard. But a lot of the BBC News coverage is bad. It deprioritizes what's happening in terms of what gets headlines and what doesn't. The Amnesty International report about genocide is a really important point. That was covered on the news channel, although BBC correspondents protested about the strapline used for part of that, which was Israel refutes or something, accusations of genocide. It wasn't covered on the news at 1, the news at 6, the news at 10. That's the biggest audience. They have a much bigger audience than the BBC News channel. So, that's the point. You get good examples of coverage, and sometimes they're buried, they're not given the priority they need, and they don't feed into the overall narrative of what's happening. They're detached from the overall narrative. So, yeah, that's the problem. That doesn't mean good coverage doesn't exist. It does, but it's a systemic problem, and that's what the journalists were talking about.
To be honest, we normally make the same distinction on this show, and I think it is those journalists who are on the ground. I mean, there are some exceptions. You get some mad ideologues on the ground as well, but those journalists on the ground tend to see things, more as they are, and they're also doing, very valuable journalism, often putting themselves at risk. Very difficult to do, of course, sort of war reporting. And when we cover sort of BBC bias and someone's done something sort of ridiculous, it tends to be someone who is commenting from London, who isn't on the ground, who I suppose is just sort of imbuing that sort of establishment idea that Israel is the sort of normal adult country, and it's the crazy Arabs who are the people who we shouldn't trust. Let's go to a BBC response. Your piece includes a number of them. So this is in reference to the statistical analysis you included in your article, which we showed in the introduction. So the BBC said, the algorithm does not provide insight into the context of the usage of particular words, either in relation to the attacks of 7th October or the Israeli offensive in Gaza. We do not think coverage can be assessed solely by counting particular words used, and do not believe this analysis demonstrates bias. So I suppose what they're saying is that analysis sort of counted how many times an Israeli death is mentioned and a Palestinian death is mentioned, and they're saying that's not actually a particularly effective way of working out how our overall coverage should be read. What's your response to that?
Well, just firstly, actually, in terms of correspondence, one point I didn't include in the article, which is really important across the piece, is after 7th of October, correspondents decamped to cover the story in Israel. And because of that, it all became framed on Israeli statements say this, Israeli leaders say that. It's just a really important point, which often gets missed, which is because there's no access to Gaza, you didn't get correspondence there. You instead had correspondence in Israel, and it all became framed around what Israeli leaders were saying. Just a really important point in terms of broadcast coverage. The point they say, the BBC, what they say there is just a load of gibberish. It's just, it's difficult to understand what point they're actually trying to make. It's just statistically a fact that they proportionately gave far more coverage to Israeli violent deaths than Palestinian violent deaths. That's just statistical fact. There's nothing they can say or do in response to deny that, because that's what they did. And it's not just the fact they gave far more proportionate coverage per Israeli death than to Palestinian deaths. The use of words is a choice. What words are used in context is a choice. Now, as an example, massacre, assault, slaughter, atrocity, these are words used far more when it is, talking about acts of Palestinian violence against Israelis than the other way around. And in fact, when those words are used at all in connection with Israeli violence, they're in quotes. They're quoting, for example, what a Palestinian person has said about Israeli actions, whereas massacre is just a word objectively used to describe what happened on the 7th of October. Equally, humanizing words, grandmother, grandfather, son, daughter, used far more proportionately in relation to Israeli deaths than to Palestinian deaths. And equally, the war crimes. I mean, you know, because some will go, and you've heard this with Keir Starmer, he'll say himself, well, I'm not doing a running commentary on whether war crimes have been committed. Let the courts decide. But he doesn't do that with Russia, does he? With Russia, he just says those are war crimes. The BBC does the same. The BBC, if you look at their coverage of Ukraine, they've not waited for a court of law to adjudicate that war crimes have been committed. In headlines and in text, they take it as read that Russia has committed war crimes in Ukraine. They don't do the same with Israel, but they do the same with atrocities committed by Hamas on the 7th of October. So the facts speak for themselves. They say, well, these words, what words were used and how many times we say this or that, that's not a good enough measurement. Well, actually, it's a pretty good measurement. It's a much better measurement than their lack of evidence. They don't offer any evidence whatsoever that they treat Palestinian life as having equal worth to Israeli life. And the reason they don't offer any evidence for that is they don't have any evidence. The BBC self-evidently treats Palestinian life as having much less value and worth than Israeli life and Western life. That's just a fact. That's what the statistics say. And that's why the BBC journalist told me that this is racism. It is racist coverage. That's their view. And that's bad enough normally, but in the context of a genocide, that is complicity in one of the worst crimes imaginable. So I think that's the point. They don't have any evidence. They can't rebut the evidence. So they just gave us word salad instead.
One more part of their response. I'm not reading all of the BBC response. People can see that in your article. They say, we reject any suggestion of a lenient stance towards either side in this conflict. The Israel-Gaza conflict is a challenging and polarizing subject to cover, but when asked to choose the one provider they would turn to for impartial reporting on this story, 3 times as many pick the BBC as choose our closest competitor. The BBC remains the world's most trusted international news source. And I suppose the response to that would be that's precisely why it's important for you to do this kind of investigation. And I suppose, actually, instead of getting you to respond to that particular point there, I want to get you to respond to something that I have seen a lot today on Twitter, which is people saying, you've done this report saying the BBC is biased in favor of Israel. I think only today the Telegraph had already published, or not already because it's independently, the Telegraph had independently published some sort of account or report that suggests that actually the BBC is biased against Israel. If sort of people are looking at this and saying, well, of course, Owen Jones thinks they're biased against Israel, but all of these other people think they're biased. Sorry, biased in fact. You can see I'm getting confused. You think they're biased in favor of Israel. Other people think they're biased in favor of the Palestinians and against Israel. How do you respond to that?
Well, I'll actually just quote Deborah Turness, the CEO of BBC News, what she wrote in October 2023 on the 25th of October 2023. Deborah Turness has rightly come under a lot of criticism, including, you'll see why in the piece. But she said, we have faced criticism and complaints that we are biased both for and against Israel and for and against the Palestinians. We cannot afford to simply say that if both sides are criticising us, we're getting things right. That isn't good enough for the BBC or for our audiences. At the BBC, we hold ourselves to a higher standard and rightly challenge ourselves to listen to our critics and consider what changes to make where we think that criticism is fair. So even she concedes that's a logical fallacy. Just because you're being criticised in quote unquote by 2 different sides doesn't mean that you have the correct position. And on that, the fact is, in our media ecosystem, voices which are pro-Israel are much, 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 much stronger. We have in Britain a very ideologically committed right-wing media, which is also very pro-Israel partisan media. They regard any deviation from basically just overt, pro-Israel propaganda as an outrage. I mean, that's how they see it. But they also use their position to police the BBC because they know they can, which is because they dominate the media ecosystem through newspapers. They use that power to try and drag the BBC ever further into their position, which is what they do successfully across the board, of course, not just when it comes to Israel and Palestine. For those who are pro-Israel cheerleaders, even, reporting on crimes committed, even reporting on Palestinian deaths is unacceptable. Anything is unacceptable as far as they're concerned, other than blind cheerleading for Israel. And the BBC doesn't do that. No one's accusing the BBC of that. What they're accusing the BBC is of being weighted drastically in favor of pro-Israel narratives. That's not good enough for the right-wing pro-Israel lobby, but nothing is ever good enough for them. But that doesn't mean, even as the BBC concede that's in any way good enough. It's a logical fallacy. What matters is what the statistics say. Do they proportionately give the same weight to Israeli and Palestinian life? No, they don't. Do they use humanizing words more for Israeli deaths than Palestinian deaths? Yes, they do. Do they consistently, as we can see through their pieces, defer to Israeli narratives and treat them as credible in the way they do with Russia? Yes, they do. We could go on. Those are the facts. The facts are what matter. Not the fact that we already knew we have a far more powerful pro-Israel ecosystem than we do a pro-Palestinian ecosystem, and therefore they can use their power much more effectively to bully anyone into submission, which we already knew.
I know you've put a lot of work into this report. Really, really fascinating stuff, and thank you so much for joining us on Novara Media this evening. Always a pleasure to have you on.
Good to see you. Cheers, buddy.
2024 will be remembered for the return of Donald Trump. It will also go down in the history books as the year the US Democrats really screwed up, faced with a candidate who they claimed was an existential threat to democracy. Until this July, they put forward a candidate who was clearly senile. And a shocking new report in the Wall Street Journal shows just how long the United States has been governed by a man suffering from cognitive decline. The report is in the Wall Street Journal and is headlined "How the White House Functioned with a Diminished Biden in Charge." It's based on interviews with 50 Democratic insiders, including, they say, people who participated in or had direct knowledge of the White House operation. And they say that since 2021, aides had been keeping meetings short and had controlled access to the president, and that they'd scripted public interactions because he couldn't do it off the cuff. Of course they did. All of this while denying there was anything wrong with the president at all. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, is any of this really a surprise? Is this really news? Are we going over the mental state of an outgoing president all over again? You already knew this. Fair enough. But some of the details in this piece are new, and they are quite extraordinary. Right? That's why I'm showing you this. For example, this. A sign that the bruising presidential schedule needed to be adjusted for Biden's advanced age had arisen early on, in just the first few months of his term. Administration officials noticed that the president became tired if meetings went long and would make mistakes. They issued a directive to some powerful lawmakers and allies seeking one-on-one time. The exchanges should be short and focused, according to people who received the message directly from White House aides. This is the shocking bit, though. If the president was having an off day, meetings could be scrapped altogether. On one such occasion, in the spring of 2021, so it's right at the start of his presidency, a national security official explained to another aide why a meeting needed to be rescheduled. Quote, "He has good days and bad days, and today was a bad day, so we're going to address this tomorrow," the former aide recalled the official saying. Now, this is like you're talking about a toddler, right? So this is in 2021, and they're saying about Joe Biden, the president of the United States, he has good days and bad days, and today's a bad day, so let's push it over there. Now, you might think, well, this is very unfortunate. You know, someone's just been elected president, and they're clearly struggling. There are certain days where they're just not in a good way, so they can't have meetings. Fine. But then how do you get from that situation to saying, and he can run another 4 years in 3 years' time? You know, he can be president for another 7 years, I suppose they would have been saying at that point in time. Completely bizarre. This one was also pretty weird. They say Biden's team also insulated him on the campaign trail. In the summer of 2023, one prominent Democratic donor put together a small event for Biden's re-election bid. The donor was shocked when a campaign official told him that attendees shouldn't expect to have a free-ranging question and answer session with the president. Instead, the organizer was told to send in 2 or 3 questions ahead of time that Biden would answer. And then they say, at some events, the Biden campaign printed the pre-approved questions on note cards and then gave donors the cards to read the questions. Even with all these steps, Biden made flubs, which confounded the donors who knew that Biden had the questions ahead of time. Right? So you've got these events where, I mean, this is already the fucked up thing about American politics, right? Where you've got these sort of round tables with a bunch of donors who are all invited to this dinner to have direct access to Joe Biden. But of course, there's no point in having direct access to Joe Biden when he can't understand your question unless it's been delivered to him beforehand. And then when you sort of have your card, which you read from, you know, like if you're in the question time audience, for example, he still doesn't know the answer, even though he's specifically been told these are the questions you're going to be asked and these are how you should answer them. The report ends in the final days of Joe Biden's campaign. On July 13, Biden held an uncomfortable call with a group of Democratic lawmakers called the New Democrat Coalition, aimed at reassuring them about his ability to stay in the race. The president told participants that polling showed he was doing fine. He became angry when challenged, according to lawmakers on the call. At one point, Biden looked up and abruptly told the group he had to go to church. Some lawmakers on the call believed someone behind the camera was shutting it down. Biden dropped out of the race 8 days later. Aaron, it's our last show of the year. I imagine this is the last time we're going to be talking about Joe Biden for any significant amount of time on Novara Live. But I do think the Democrats basically handing the presidency to Donald Trump because the people around Joe Biden thought it was acceptable to put this man forward for another 4 years when they had to tell senior Democrats, oh, he's having a bad day today, so we're going to have to reschedule. I mean, it is a pretty remarkable way for the republic to fall. I mean, if you believe the Democrats' rhetoric earlier in the year, that's what they thought a Trump election would mean.
Well, guess what, Michael? The Democratic Party establishment is full of crap. They're full of garbage. You said you're right to say this as well. It's one thing to put him up once. It's a crisis election. You get rid of Trump. You have the quote unquote resistance. You have COVID. But the second time, just crazy. And I think, frankly, you look at the details of this story, Michael, the Democratic Party have lost any right whatsoever to ever run the United States, certainly to ever send someone to the Oval Office ever again. If you were a floating voter and you read that, you would think, well, look, I don't like Donald Trump, but at least the Republican establishment tried to stop the guy. In the case of the Democrats, they were pushing it. He was their dude. He could barely form words, like you say. He was sometimes treated like a toddler. Oh, he's having a bad day. He literally can start a nuclear war. He has executive powers. He has extraordinary powers, the President of the United States. Oh, he has a bad day. He can't talk today. That is how you talk about a 2 or 3 year old. And so I think, frankly, it does, like I've just said a moment ago, underscore the fact the Democrats should never, ever send another president to the Oval Office ever again. This was their plan. This was the blueprint. Whereas Trump, at least, like I say, the Republicans can say it was an aberration. We never wanted the guy. Absolutely crazy. And then you go to the point about donors. Michael, what sort of person does it take to give $50, $100 million, $10 million, $1 million to a political organization? You're giving that money for status or because you believe in it or nepotism or whatever. For whatever reason, you're giving a lot of money to an organization like the Democrats, and they raised a heck of a lot during the last election campaign, right? And then this guy's in charge. Someone who literally can't formulate full sentences. I mean, how does that make you feel? Surely you'd think, this is a waste of money. Why am I wasting my money? There are so many other causes I could give it to. And this is, the country which talks about being the mother of democracies. It exports democracy all around the world. And yet you have a party establishment which stitched up, I think, Biden in 2020. Not to the same extent that Hillary was stitched up in 2016 against Bernie Sanders, but clearly there was a move to get Biden, and he was the unity candidate, the stop Bernie candidate in 2020. And this was the person who they had to push ultimately, so they could keep Bernie Sanders out and all his brochurists out, who, by the way, many of which went on to vote for Trump. It really does say a hell of a lot about the idiocy of the American liberal establishment.
I think it could also be really embarrassing for the Democratic. I don't want to predict someone's end. It's very plausible that Joe Biden, doesn't last the next 4 years, and so it is going to be really obviously, when a big politician dies in the United States or in any country, really, you have this big outpouring of sort of public, commentary or idolizing about them, and if that does happen in the next 4 years, that's going to be another example where everyone is pointing to these guys and saying, this was the guy you told us was fit and strong and could, be a really sprightly, brilliant president for another 4 years. I'm wondering if we're going to see, a kind of the Death of Stalin type movie, which is based on those 4 years of trying to pretend that Joe Biden was completely fine the whole time. 14 years after the start of the Arab Spring, Egyptians are governed by a regime more repressive than ever. And someone who knows that more than most is Laila Soueif, a human rights activist and professor of mathematics at Cairo University. Soueif is currently on day 82 of a hunger strike, calling for the release of her son, Alaa Abdel Fattah, who has been in detention on trumped-up charges of spreading false news since 2019. Abdel Fattah, a 43-year-old UK national, is a prominent blogger and writer and was a leading figure in the 2011 Arab Spring. He's been in and out of detention multiple times, and in this instance has already served a 5-year jail sentence. However, earlier this year, Abdel Fattah's family were told he wouldn't be released until January 2027, as the authorities refused to count the time he previously spent in pre-trial detention as part of his prison sentence. A vigil was held for Abdel Fattah last night in Downing Street, and today I had the privilege of speaking to Laila Soueif in the Novara Media studio. I began by asking Laila why she has chosen the hunger strike as a form of protest.
Because everything else has failed, actually. I mean, we've done, a lot of petitioning and demonstrating, and in Egypt it's very difficult anyway, because people who stand by, you get arrested and stuff like that. And here in Britain, my daughters have already done sit-ins outside the Foreign Office. We've done pretty much everything. And we finally, when Ala actually was not released on the date on which she was supposed to be released, I realized that this could really just go on forever. And I also realized that both the Egyptian and the British government will not really move on this unless they have a crisis in their hands. I decided to create a crisis. I thought my hunger strike would actually create a crisis, which it seems to have done. And this is the first time I've had the full attention of the British government. And you can never be sure in Egypt, but I think I've got the attention of the Egyptian government as well. So maybe this time we'll get something done.
And before we move on to the issue you're protesting and how our government are responding, you're on day 82 now of a hunger strike, right? That's a very extreme thing to put your body through. How are you holding up?
Miraculously, so far, I haven't had any dire consequence. I'm tired, and I get tired very easily, but I haven't had any dire consequences from my hunger strike. I assume that I'm still in the phase where the body just burns extra fat. I was quite plump. I've lost like 20 kilos, and maybe I've still got 10 kilos to go or something before something terrible happens. But I really didn't expect to come this far. I told David Lammy when I met him almost a month ago that we've been given a lucky break. I didn't expect my body to hold out this far. So let's not waste it. I'm saying that is more urgent now because we really are probably. There's no way of knowing this. I mean, even the doctors say there's no way of knowing this. You can't know when you're going to collapse. But we're getting closer anyway, so I hope this thing finishes before we get there.
And can you talk to us about your son, Ala? Are you aware of his treatment during his imprisonment or how he's doing now?
We get a letter once a week and we get a visit once a month. The visit is for 20 minutes. That's all the visits in Egyptian prisons now are for 20 minutes once a month. And our visit has the extra restriction of being behind a glass barrier, talking through a phone, so that, everything you say gets recorded, etc. But at least we are assured of his health. His mood has been very down since he was not released on his. He keyed up himself to be released on that date. So now his mood is very down. He's very angry. He's very angry at both governments, and he's very worried about me.
So the fact your son was in jail in the first place, it has been condemned by the likes of Amnesty. It's sort of trumped up charges. But even according to Egyptian law, he should have been released now, right? Because he's spent 2 years in detention before he was sentenced. So what's your understanding of why he's still in prison?
My understanding is that the regime really doesn't want to release anybody if they can help it. I mean, I have a friend who's another university professor. He's over 70. He was Muslim Brotherhood, so they're even worse. They treat them even worse than they've treated Ala. He's been found innocent by the Court of Cassation since 2018. He's still in jail. So that's just one case. We've got hundreds of cases like that.
And do you think that's because the regime is scared of anyone they see as potential opposition? Obviously, they prefer them to be behind bars so they're not causing trouble or demonstrating.
They're scared. They're vengeful. They're lots of things, but mainly, yes, I think mainly because they're scared, and also because they're sending a scare message to people. If you do anything, that's how you'll end up.
You're in Britain now. You've been lobbying the British government. Can you talk about what you're hearing from them? What do you want to hear from them?
Firstly, I expect any government, particularly a government that pretends to respect the rule of law, to care for the rights and the safety of its citizens. Ala is binational, and so am I. So, and the British and the Egyptian governments are not enemy governments; they're allies. So for me, they're both responsible for Allah's rights and for Allah's safety, and they should both, deliver our rights as citizens. But this is particularly so in the case of the British government, because it is a government that claims to uphold the rule of law, that claims to abide by the statutes of human rights, so it should be held responsible. What I'm expecting from the British government is to use its good relations with the Egyptian government, its alliance with the Egyptian government, to set Ala free. And right now, after a lot of talk with the Foreign Office, with different MPs and so on, what I really want is that, because, this is not a reflection on the Foreign Office here. I know how the regime in Egypt works, and I know that it works top down. I know that nothing will move if it's not given the green light by President Sisi personally. So right now, what I'm hoping for is that the Prime Minister will intervene personally to talk to Mr. Sisi and persuade him to give the green light on this case. I think he's capable of doing that. I think he is probably the only one placed to do so.
Do you think persuasion is something which is within the British government's gift when it comes to Sisi, or do you think that there might be, economic pressure as something that might need to be put on the Egyptian government?
That's something for the government to judge, actually. But from what I understand, the things the Egyptian government seems to want, like an economic conference with Britain and more investment and so on, seem to be things that the British want to do them. So I don't see, I don't see that. But that's something for the government to judge. I just see it as half persuasion, half leverage, something in between.
David Lammy is obviously the current British Foreign Secretary. I know when he was Shadow Foreign Secretary, so when he was in opposition, he was quite supportive of you in the campaign to get your son released. Do you think he's carried that enthusiasm into government, or is there an element of realpolitik, whereby when someone enters government, they suddenly have a slight change in emphasis and priorities?
There is an element of realpolitik, and I suppose that's to be expected. But also, realpolitik does not mean you back down. What it means is you put. For me, what it means anyway is that you your aims, but you work on them, maybe in a different manner, but you still work on them and you still push for them. Mr. Lamy has been pushing. It's just that, again, as I said, the most Mr. Lamy, I assume the most Mr. Lamy can do is to push the Foreign Office in Egypt. The Foreign Office in Egypt might be the place to push once they've been given the green light by the presidency. However hard you push them, if they haven't been given the green light by the presidency, all they'll do is stonewall you.
So your son was a leading figure in the 2011 revolution, as you and many of your family members were. Egypt is now ruled by a regime many people see as even more repressive than the guy who was in charge back then, so Mubarak, of course. How do you look back on the Arab Spring in Egypt and its legacy?
The Arab Spring itself was a time of heady hope. Now is a time of counter-revolutionary triumph. So from that prospect, things look very bad. On the other hand, when I look back on the years before the Arab, because I'm so much older, when I look back on the years before the Arab Spring, I would still rather be where we are than where we were. I keep telling people who were too young to see what it was like then, that for me at least, it feels much better to be part of a popular movement, even a defeated popular movement, than to be part of small groups who only get to talk to each other, which is what we were before the Arab Spring.
The Arab Spring, has been positioned as something that's in the past, something that's over, something that failed, potentially. The surprise fall of President Assad, though, now, of course, former President Assad in Syria, has led some people to say maybe the Arab Spring is still going on. Maybe these Arab dictators aren't as safe as they might have very recently seen. How are you personally viewing recent events in Syria?
Well, for one thing, I'm elated that al-Assad is out. Of course, I see, the problems Syria is facing. Anyone can see them. But nothing that we have seen, maybe since the Middle Ages, equals the sort of repression Syria was under. So, I know that we have many times said it can't get worse, and it's gotten worse. But I really don't see how Syria can get worse. I mean, nothing. And that's one side of it. The other side of it is when we actually saw, the inside of Assad's jails. There's a message there, because I and so many prisoners' families in Egypt know that we have something exactly like that, although on a much smaller scale in Egypt. So I'm hoping that people, will. I mean, a lot of people do believe us, but it's different when you actually see the stuff. When you actually see those people coming out of, years and years of detention. So I'm hoping that it will raise everyone's consciousness in the whole area. And to get back to your words, no, the Arab Spring is not over. It's going through a very down period at the moment, but you only have to look. Every time it sort of gets stamped on, it comes up somewhere else. It came up in Sudan and everyone was so surprised. Now Sudan has been, pushed into a civil war, but it does keep coming up somewhere else. So no, it's not over. in a way, it can't be over because, conditions people are living under in the whole of the Arab world are becoming more and more intolerable. And people in power like Sisi or wherever, they are not doing, okay, you can be a dictator and stabilize a country if you're at least making people's lives better in some other form. But you can't be a dictator and just repress people while economic conditions are in free downfall and stabilize anything.
That was Laila Soueif speaking to me earlier today in the Novara Media studio. It was really impressive to have someone who's on day 82 of their hunger strike come to speak to us here. With a disgraced new American president set to be inaugurated in January, Keir Starmer appears to have decided it's time for us to send a new disgraced ambassador across the Atlantic. Yes, Peter Mandelson has been confirmed as Britain's next ambassador in Washington. Despite some inside Britain's Foreign Office allegedly urging the Prime Minister to stick with current US Ambassador Dame Karen Pierce, known in some quarters as the Trump Whisperer, Starmer's allies say he ultimately believed the case was overwhelming for picking Mandy, particularly given his experience in trade issues from his time as an EU commissioner. Mandelson is, of course, also a famed media operator, a minister under Blair and Brown. He was before that Labour's communications chief in the 1980s when he became known as the Prince of Darkness. He can do Fox News and the other TV channels, and that's a big part of the job, a source close to the process told the Financial Times. And of course, that isn't to say he comes without baggage, to say the least. Mandelson had to resign from the cabinet not once, but twice during the Blair years, and he hasn't said the most savoury things about Trump himself, so the person he's going to have to make a relationship with. In 2019, Mandelson went on the podcast of Elaine Elkin, an Italian journalist, and described Trump as a danger to the world and little short of a white nationalist and racist. But it's his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein that now makes Mandelson especially controversial. The closeness of that relationship was explored in a recent documentary on Channel 4.
Epstein was free to continue to conduct business as usual, and our source says he witnessed an intriguing phone call.
While I was there, he received a call and said, "Hello, Petey." And he chatted away. And Petey wanted to meet Jamie Dimon, who was then the chairman of JP Morgan. And by the time he said, "Yes, I'll sort it out," put the phone down, and Petey turned out to be none other than the Secretary of the Board of Trade, Peter Mandelson. I was astonished that a British cabinet minister at that time, probably the most powerful man other than the Prime Minister, was calling Jeffrey in jail to make an appointment or to seek an appointment with a very powerful banker in New York.
In 2005, Peter Mandelson had been snapped casually shopping with Epstein in the US Virgin Islands.
But I think it demonstrated that as far as Jeffrey was concerned, life was carrying on as if nothing had happened.
And the phone call worked?
Yeah, no, it was sorted out.
Did you get a sense from him how well he knew Peter Mandelson?
Well, clearly you don't call Peter Mandelson Petey if you're not a close friend.
In a statement for this programme, lawyers for Lord Mandelson said,
"Our client has no recollection of a telephone conversation with Mr. Epstein in January 2009, in which he allegedly requested that Mr. Epstein set up a meeting with Jamie Dimon, chairman and CEO of JP Morgan. Our client would have no need whatsoever to make such a request. As business secretary, he met or talked on the phone to bank CEOs on a regular basis, including Mr. Dimon. These contacts were all arranged through his government office."
Of course, there are also multiple pictures of Donald Trump with Epstein, and Donald Trump has himself been subject to a slew of allegations of sexual assault, some upheld in court. So perhaps, one might think, Mandelson's apparent comfort in the presence of sex offenders could prove to be a positive in terms of British influence in the United States. Well, Trump world seems to disagree. Trump's allies have already been hitting back. Chris Lasevita wrote this on Twitter. The UK government is special. Replace a professional university-educated ambassador with an absolute moron. He should stay home. Sad. Mandelson described Trump as a danger to the world and little short of a white nationalist. You can see how the people around Donald Trump just imitate how he tweets, which is a bit sad itself, I think. In case you haven't heard of La Soueif, he is a big deal in US conservative circles. He was a senior advisor on Donald Trump's 2024 presidential campaign, but is also the chief operating officer of the Republican National Committee. So one might assume those comments could have some sway among those around the president-elect. Aaron, what do you make of this decision, sending Peter Mandelson to Washington?
Petey. Michael, whatever happened to decency in politics? Do you remember that? Do you remember Keir Starmer telling off the Tories on a daily basis? We need to bring back decency. Is it decency to have had to resign from cabinet twice for corruption scandals? Is it decency to call a paedophile when they're in prison in order to get the number and the contact details of the CEO of Goldman Sachs? Is that decency?
He's not. It's not decency, Aaron. That's my answer for you. We're doing panto here.
Good. Well, I'm glad we've established it's the season, Michael. I'm glad we've established that. So look, for years, for 18 months, we were sadly subject to these daily, volleys, these verbal volleys from Keir Starmer and the Labour shadow cabinet. We're going to bring back integrity and decency. Do you remember this one? Country before party. Decency, country before party. So I'm going to make a party apparatchik who's been working in the Labour Party since the 1980s, is very much a party man. I'm going to make this person, who, by the way, also calls paedophiles the world's most famous paedophile in prison. I'm going to make that person the ambassador to the world's most powerful country. Does that sound like country before party to you? Does that sound like decency and public office to you? No, of course it's not. Labour are full of crap. Keir Starmer is full of crap. And look, for people out there who say, well, all politicians are the same, that's a line that is completely unhelpful. I agree with you, by the way. But on this stuff, Keir Starmer is literally no different to Boris Johnson. In fact, from what I understand, this is the first political appointment to the US ambassador in 50 years, which is to say that when Boris Johnson, and when his conservative predecessors made this appointment, they generally drew upon the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. They generally went along with the normal protocol. Keir Starmer, by contrast, has selected somebody who is a party man, a party loyalist, who will answer to him, but also, more importantly, who will answer to his advisors, people like Morgan McSweeney. That is the opposite. That is the antithesis of country before party. Boris Johnson, in selecting for the US ambassador to the UK, the Tories in selecting for the US ambassador, the UK ambassador to the US, they were selecting more for country before party than Keir Starmer is. It's almost like these accusations that he was throwing against the Tories were actually somewhat directed at himself. You know what they say, Michael? When you point the finger at someone, three are coming right back at you. And I feel that really captures Keir Starmer and his exercise on decency.
Is that something about Keir Starmer, or do you think it's just stupid for politicians to ever make decency their pitch, because sort of politics is inherently a dirty game?
I really think you're letting him up. So look, you might be watching this, you might think this, Michael. You might be listening to this. I think typical Aaron, he's putting the boot in with Keir Starmer. As I've said, this has the idea of a political appointment for UK ambassador to the US hasn't happened in 50 years. It's very unusual. This is deeply, deeply unusual. So the idea that this is just business as usual, this is what politicians do. No, actually. And also, let's remember, Michael, since he left public office, he was a lord and a very senior member of the cabinet under Gordon Brown. He's basically been in the world of interest representation, lobbying, global council. He started it. Okay, it was his thing, basically selling political influence. We've now made an arch lobbyist this country's ambassador to the US. Okay, so we've got so many things going on here, Michael. Keir Starmer, country before party, decency. Oh, and by the way, we're not going to give lobbyists loads of power. Those days are over. It's the complete converse to all the things he was promising. So it's not business as usual. This is deeply unhealthy. And if the Conservative Party had a man who was a lobbyist, who was involved in a business with the kinds of influence and power that Global Council does, who was on first name terms with so many billionaires, including Russian ones. By the way, he said those things about Donald Trump on that podcast to the divorced husband of a lady who's basically the most powerful family in Italy, the Agnellis. That man who hosts the podcast is the father of Lapo Elkan, who is, he's one of the doyens of Italian civil society. So even when he speaks to journalists and podcasts, Michael, it's to millionaires. That's Peter Mandelson. So you have somebody with that kind of profile, these interests, that history. Like I say, he had to resign twice from cabinet. He calls a paedophile in prison to get the details of somebody who might be useful to him. If this was a conservative, Michael, imagine if this was a conservative and a conservative PM, Boris Johnson or Theresa May, or whoever, David Cameron, made him this country's ambassador to the US. How do you think The Guardian would respond? Be honest. How do you think the BBC would respond? Be honest. I've seen John Sopel on X saying this is a great, clever decision. I can't remember the exact formulation of words, something to that effect. Right decision, good decision. How do you think John Sopel would have responded if that exact same set of characteristics, that history, that CV, had been applied to a conservative person and he was made the ambassador to the US? I suspect you would have had a rather different response. What do I know?
No, you make the case persuasively, Aaron. You make the case persuasively. Let's end the year on some news that I do think will get you in a festive spirit. Keir Starmer has nominated 30 former Labour MPs, staff and union leaders to the House of Lords. Kerry Badenoch has nominated 6 people, while the Lib Dems have put forward 2. Labour are sort of saying they're nominating quite so many to try and balance out the Lords. They include, I'm not going to read you all 30. I'll read you the ones you might have heard of. Luciana Berger, who, she was. She stood for who did she stand for? The Lib Dems in the end. She was a Labour MP, of course. Mary Boosted, not bad. Former General Secretary of the National Education Union. Who else have we got here? Fangam Debonair, who I think before the election dismissed the idea that she would possibly go to the Lords if she was beaten by the Greens. David Evans, Sue Gray. God, she's been around. Lots of different jobs for her. Mike Katz, National Chair of the Jewish Labour Movement. Deborah Matteson, former Director of Strategy to Sir Keir Starmer. Aaron, how are you feeling about these 30 nominations to the House of Lords from the Labour Party? We can go to the Tories and Lib Dems in one moment.
Country before party, Michael. That's how Keir Starmer rolls, country before party. So we're going to make dozens of has-beens, including former MPs, unelected legislators for life. Because of course, Mike Katz and Luciana Berger, they are, and David Evans, of the several hundred people that are going to be unelected legislators for life, they're perfect. And there's nobody else out there that has done more stuff for the public good, for the public interest, that's more intelligent, that's achieved more. No. These are party apparatchiks. Again, it just makes a complete mockery of this whole thing of country before party. Keir Starmer, the Labour Party, and by the way, both parties, that's literally how a two-party system works. You put the party before the country. That's how it works. You have a two-party system. If you have a multi-party system where we can talk about the merits of one or the other, but you don't have to be a party loyalist, a party man. You can join another party, you can start another party. It's quite easy. It's quite low cost to entry. When you have a two-party system, if your party gets rid of you, you're kind of screwed, right? So people really have to be loyal. Loyalty is really prized. Subservience and obsequiousness is really useful. So actually, we tend to elevate people who aren't particularly effective at doing stuff. You might have noticed that's kind of how British politics works. So we have lots of really terminally useless people constantly pushed up because of how our two-party system works. The idea that it's country before party. Give me a break. Mike Katz. Well, because he said some nice tweets about Keir Starmer? Because he called people, left-wing people in the Labour Party, he called them racist? Mike, thanks so much. You called some people racist. Here's a peerage. You don't have to thank me. You can be an unelected legislator for life. How's that sound? Luciana Berger. What's Luciana Berger done? I'm not criticizing who she is or what has she done to deserve that? What has she done? Was she in cabinet and the last Labour government and do something? Did she introduce some incredible piece of legislation? What has she done? She's now going to be a legislator in this country for the rest of her life.
Let's go to the Tory ones. Nigel Biggar, chair of the Free Speech Union, professor at Oxford. I think he wrote the book sort of saying colonialism might not have been that bad. Toby Young, people will have heard of Toby Young, founder and director of the Free Speech Union and associate editor of The Spectator. So of the 6 Tory nominees, 2 of them are from the Free Speech Union, the Lib Dems, a Sheffield city councillor, and a former president of the Liberal Democrats. Anything of note there, Aaron, for you? Anything stands out?
Well, not really. I mean, people are mocking Toby Young. Oh, like, there's loads of like sort of progressives on Twitter. Oh, Toby Young, how did he do it? What you think Mike Katz is better than Toby Young? You think that Luciana Berger is better than Toby Young? Okay, David Evans, he was the general secretary when Labour won. Okay, that is something. I get it, right? What? Give me a break. Come on. Are you kidding?
This was a very entertaining way to end the year. I'm glad we did this, Aaron. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, and thank you for spending pretty much every Friday over the past year with me. It's been an absolute delight every time we have these sessions together.
I've loved it too, Michael. Look, here's to a great 2025 for Novara Media. And to all those people out there, I hope you have a wonderful Christmas and a great New Year.
Before we go, a couple more comments in the Comstock. Samantha Bond, thank you for your commitment to integral truth. You are all amazing. Solidarity and love. And Gassan, hello. I don't know how you guys do it, but I love tuning in. Merry Christmas. And let's end on that. Merry Christmas to all of you. Thank you so much for sticking with us through 2024. We'll return in the new year. Again, if you do want to support us in 2025, the place to go is novaramedia.com/support. The link to that is, of course, in the descriptions. If you're already a supporter, thank you so much. And especially Merry Christmas to you. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.